Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Can everyone hear me today?
Wa alaikum assalam. We can hear you, Shaykha.
Alhamdulillah. Okay, inshallah, we will get started. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Can everyone hear me today?
Wa alaikum assalam.
All right, I think we're good. Alhamdulillah. I'm learning. This is a, using technology to teach is a amazing learning experience for myself and my family. Alhamdulillah. And every time I have a class, I feel like I'm learning something new about myself and about how to engage the community through the technology that we have been, alhamdulillah, blessed with. We're still able to connect. So inshallah, we'll start with dua and then we'll get started today with the tafsir of the third part of Surah Abasa. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم اللهم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم نوينا التعلم والتعليم والتذكر والتذكير والنفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله وسنة رسوله والدعاء إلى الهدى والدلالة على الخير وابتغاء وجه الله ومرضاته وقربه وثوابه سبحانه وتعالى وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, all praise is due to God, Lord of the world, and peace and blessings be upon our Master Muhammad, his family and followers and companions. We intend to learn and to teach, to remind and be reminded, to benefit and be benefited, to improve and be improved, to encourage holding fast to the book of God and the way of his messenger, to call to guidance and to direct towards good, hoping for the countenance of God and his pleasure and his proximity and his reward. And peace and blessings of Allah be upon our Master Muhammad and his noble family and his sincere followers and companions. Ameen. So, it's really, alhamdulillah, it's an honor to be with all of you. And I'm excited to complete the surah with both our online attendees, for those of you who are attending through Zoom with the password, as well as those who are attending through YouTube. Now, let me pull up just a second the slides for everyone. It's not sharing, just one moment. All right, alhamdulillah, here we are. Journey through the Qur'an, Tafsir of Surah Abasa, verses 33 through 42. Inshallah, we'll get started with that right away. فإذا جاء أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فإذا جاءت الصاخة يوم يفر المرء من أخيه وأمه وأبيه وصاحبته وبنيه لكل امرئ منهم يومئذ شأن يغنيه وجوه يومئذ مسفرة ضاحكة مستبشرة ووجوه يومئذ عليها غبرة ترحقها قترة أولئك هم الكفرة الفجرة. So when the piercing cry does come, that day when a man will flee from his brother, and his mother and his father, and his spouse and his children, for every man that day his affair shall suffice him. Faces that day shall be shining and radiant, laughing, joyous. And faces that day shall be covered in dust, overspread with darkness. Those, they are the disbelievers, the profligates. So we'll start with the first verses. Here, فَإِذَا جَاءَتِ الصَّاخَّةُ. Something just to note, and we learned this when in learning tajweed, and also in our tafsir classes overseas, is that there is in the Quranic style, sometimes the meaning of the verse is also expressed through its sound. And so there are two long meds in this, in the first verse. It's like, how would it's hard to, when it's recited in Arabic, that elongation creates a natural emphasis. And it's something powerful to experience in the meaning that's associated with it as well. So it's hard to even translate into English, but it's almost like it's saying, so when the piercing cry does come, or you could also say, so when the piercing cry does come, and even that doesn't, it doesn't translate over really well in English, but it's there in the Arabic language. There's this elongation in the word coming, right? Because the verb comes first, ja'at comes first, and that's elongated. And then as-sakha is the piercing cry. And that had the word itself has heavy letters, so there's a heaviness in it. And then the fact that it's elongated also emphasizes the meaning through the sound of the way it's recited itself. That's something that even in the recitation, the flow of the surah, there's like a distinction you feel between the verses that came before and then this, right? Now we're talking about the Day of Judgment. Now we're talking about something that's very heavy. And remember, prior to that, there's a reminder of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his blessings to us and us being grateful to him because of those blessings, right? The verses that we discussed last week. So a couple things about the meaning here. The piercing cry, as-sakha, is the second blast that occurs on the Day of Judgment from the angel Israfil. And that second blast is what causes the human beings to be resurrected. And they start essentially marching in the right direction from that. They start heading towards where the judgment will take place. And the sound is described with this word, the piercing cry. It's interesting in the word, in the Arabic language, the fourth form of the verb actually means to lend one's ear, to. So suwicha or sawwacha. And so when this word, which is a masdar form, right, the piercing cry comes, it's like you didn't just lend your ear, you gave all of your ear over. And Ibn Ajiba mentions that it's described in this way because the sound is so powerful that it will cause deafness in the ears. Like it's such a loud sound that it will cause either deafness or almost deafness. People will not be able to hear anything. It's that sound. It's that loud. Imam al-Baghawi and Imam Ibn Kathir also mentioned this, that it will almost deafen those who hear it. Others, again, Ibn Kathir mentions that as-sakha, the piercing cry, is one of the proper names for the Day of Judgment. So on one hand, there's an interpretation that it's the specific piercing sound of the second trumpet that's blown by the angel Israfil. There's another interpretation that it's referring to the Day of Judgment itself. So when this Day of Judgment comes, again, there's both interpretations exist. يوم يفر المرء من أخيه وأمه وأبيه وصاحبته وبنيه. That day when a man will flee from his brother, his mother, and his father, and his spouse and his children. What's interesting about the order that these that's mentioned here, and Ibn Ajiba mentions this in his tafsir, or he quotes it, I should say, in his tafsir, is that a person would flee from their equal, right, their brother, and their mother and their father. And in family life, right, a person is first born, and the first people that they know, the people that they are immediately close to, is their mother and their father and their siblings. And so this category is mentioned first, like the people that you first knew as a human being when you first came into the world, you would flee from them, and that's your immediate family. And then the spouse and the children, because of the love that a person has. One is the family that a person comes from, which they have no choice. And then the second is the family which a person has chosen for themselves, right? The spouse and also their children, and that they sought to have children. So, those essentially, those human beings who were the most important to us, were the most essential to us, were the most, we can't imagine our lives without them. We would sacrifice for all of these people, right? Ithar, when you think about preferring someone over yourself, people naturally would prefer their brothers and their sisters and their parents and their spouse and their kids to themselves. That's a natural category. But on this day, those people that we in this life would normally prefer to ourselves, we would flee from, right? And that's something that's really hard to imagine, right? If you can think about your mother and your father and the idea that you would literally flee from their presence. If you can think about your siblings, that it doesn't matter who they are on that day, you don't recognize, as a mother and kids on that day, everyone is fleeing and they're not paying attention to who's who. And it's mentioned that the terror of the Day of Judgment will be so severe that people actually will not be concerned with anyone other than themselves. And it's mentioned that even a human being or a man would go so far as to ransom himself from the punishment of that day at the price of his own children and his spouse and his brother and his kin who had sheltered him and all who are on the earth, that it might save him. The interesting thing about this world is that if a person is going through any amount of difficulty or pain in this world, at some point, right, the body shuts down. A person would faint. They'd pass out. They'd go into a coma, right? And in some cases, they die, right? So that's when pain reaches that level, a person can just die. And that in death, there's a perception of the end of whatever suffering that is being experienced. But on the Day of Judgment, you can't just be like, oh, I wish I could just die, because you've already died. Now you're in the eternal realm. And so you're in al-akhirah, right? So there is no, the worldly death that we think about as like an end to suffering, or like a coma, or like a, just fainting, or not actually having to deal with what is overwhelming. Because in this world, when the human body, physical material body, is overwhelmed, it goes into a state that makes it not have to perceive what it's going through, or it can in many different ways. But we don't have that in the Day of Judgment. And so on the Day of Judgment, people just have to bear that day with all of its, horrors. And you can't you can't die from it. You have to experience it. Or, people, mankind will have to experience it. And so that's why people, out of just, panic, there are people who would ransom their entire families just to not have to deal with it. That's the state they're in. And there's a famous hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ where he says that on the day of judgment, the people will actually be gathered barefoot, naked, and uncircumcised. And he was asked, it was actually by a woman, some say it was Aisha radiallahu anha, like, "O Messenger of Allah, will we look upon each other in nakedness? Like people will be able to see each other?" And the Prophet ﷺ, he says, "Oh Aisha, the matter is greater than that." Meaning like this, what you're asking about, it's such a heavy thing that these concerns that we have in the world today, that's not even going to be in, we're not going to even have that level of cognition to be worried about that at that time. And he recited the verses, "For every man that day his affair," or it's actually imri'in is not just man, it's for every person on that day, their affair shall suffice them. لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مِّنْهُمْ يَوْمَئِذٍ شَأْنٌ يُغْنِيهِ. For every person that day, his or her affair shall suffice them. Everyone will be concerned about their own affair, their own standing with God. And it will be enough. It will be just worrying about themselves, it will take all of their attention and all of their concern and all of their focus. They will not be able to focus on things like the fact that people are not wearing clothing, or what state other people are in. They're just going to be focused on themselves. And after that level and the weight of the day is described, right? Again, in the Qur'an, there's a description of two categories of people who have very, very different ends. There's this heaviness that mankind witnesses together, and then after the reckoning, right? So you have kind of a fast forward. You have the moment that the trumpet is blown, and people are resurrected, and people are fleeing from one another, and there's a level of chaos. And then now you have a fast forward to after people have received their records and their judgments and the consequences of what will happen for them. And so it's described, وُجُوهٌ يَوْمَئِذٍ مُسْفِرَةٌ. Faces that day shall be radiant and shining. This describes the hearts of believers. It's said, one of the beautiful statements that's said is, the face of a person is a mirror to their heart. So it's actually what's being described as the face, but this is a reflection of the state of their heart. So their face is shining and radiant because their hearts are shining and radiant in this moment. There's, interestingly, in tafsir, there's the mufassirin, they have different, they say this is for different reasons on that day. So there are some who say that the believers' faces are shining and radiant because of the joy that they are experiencing in their hearts from the glad tidings that are given to them and that are manifested on their faces. And part of that comes from, Ibn Kathir mentions that. Imam al-Qurtubi and Imam al-Razi say that it's because of the wudu that they used to perform in this life. So there's, we wash ourselves physically, right, with water, and we make wudu, purify ourselves for prayer, for worship. And the reason why their faces are going to be glowing is it's like a metaphysical unveiling of what the wudu did to them, how it brightened them and made them luminous. So this is one opinion. The second opinion, or that's also mentioned, is that their faces are shining in that way because they are people of Qiyamul Layl, because they stood in the night and they prayed at that time. And there's discussion about how doing the night vigil, tahajjud or Qiyamul Layl, all of that brings light into a person's face in particular. It brings light into their hearts, but also that shows up on their face to the extent that in traditional times in Islamic history, it's mentioned that there were women who they sought to beautify even their appearance by getting up for tahajjud, because they could tell that worship actually helps to beautify them. SubhanAllah. So the anti-aging cream of the past was not whatever people are taking now. It was to get up and pray tahajjud. This belief that their physical appearance, or specifically their face, manifests the purification in their hearts. And then the third is that there's a relief from their faces are so bright on that day because they feel, after they have received the glad tidings, that they are now relieved from all of the burdens and all of the attachments of this world. Imam al-Razi mentions this. So, subhanAllah, believers are joyous when they receive the reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it shows up in their faces. The word dahikatan, laughing, mustabshira, joyous. It's the root of mustabshira. So you can say abshir, which means be happy, be joyed, because I'm going to give you good news. Mustabshira is like it's like someone who's seeking the good news, right? They're laughing and they have good news. It's like, give me more of this good news. Just keep telling me what's going to happen because it's all good news. I'm trying to imagine how it can, an analogy for that. It's like, it's hard to make an analogy because this is the ultimate sort of test, but a very minuscule, terrible analogy that I can maybe make for this is if someone is getting their report card and they know they've tried their best, and their parents open the report card and they see, whatever the classes, they say, on this class you got an A, and on this class you got an A, and on this class and you got an A, and the person was so worried that they may have failed the exam or not done well, but then as their parent starts telling them that they got a really high score, it's like, keep giving me the good news, tell me to complete the entire list, and it's all A, 100%, 100%, 100%. Like that's kind of the scene of someone who's just laughing from the joy, and it's like, give me more of the news, because it's all good news right now. I mean, and this is for the person who knows that they're going to be going to paradise. This is for the person who knows that they have received the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May we be from them, inshallah. May we have these radiant and shining faces, laughing and joyous. May we be like that together on that day, inshallah. Ameen. And it's mentioned that now when you look at these verses right here in particular, remember what the surah started with, right? I'm going to ask people in the chat box real quick. Okay. Remember what the surah started with. Who could these verses be describing? I'm going to stop the share just for a moment so I can see the chat box. Okay. So who could these verses be describing? Look at the beginning. The surah is called Abasa, right? He frowned. Here we're talking about believers who are joyous. And yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Janice Mahnur. Barakallahu fiki. Thank you so much. Abdullah ibn Maktoum, or Ibn Maktoum, sorry. Abdullah ibn Maktoum. And this is the blind man. So subhanAllah, these verses, and we talked about in the first part of the tafsir of these verses, how amazing was Abdullah ibn Maktoum. What an amazing companion of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ he was. That, he comes to as the beginning verses, it's in the story of the beginning verses, is he's coming to talk to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. At the same time, there's a category of people that the Prophet ﷺ is trying to call to Islam. And they are from a different category. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala redirects the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ's attention to Abdullah ibn Maktoum, or Ibn Maktoum, because this is a sincere person who's coming and asking and, like earnestly seeking to be benefited by the Prophet Muhammad SAW and learn his deen. And so the Prophet Muhammad SAW is redirected to give his attention to him. And the second category of people are the ones who think they are, they are not in need of religion. They don't need to hear about the message. They don't need to know about God. They don't need to know about the truth and the hereafter. They don't care. It's not immediately convenient for their material worldly concerns. And so it's a level of arrogance, which is like, I don't care, the mentality, which is, I don't care if God exists or if he doesn't exist. I don't care if there is a truth that I should be following or not be following. That is a degree of istighna, right? That I don't need God, or I don't need religion, I don't need faith. And in that is arrogance, and in that is a rejection of truth, because they don't even want to consider it. Reject it, knowing that it's the truth, which these people did. So I'm going to go back and that's this compare now to the next category of people. ووجوه يومئذ عليها غبرة ترحقها قترة أولئك هم الكفرة الفجرة. And faces that day shall be covered in dust, overspread with darkness. They are the disbelievers, the profligates. It's mentioned that we can put Abdullah ibn Maktoum in the first category, and we can put the people from the Quraysh that rejected the truth of when the Prophet ﷺ was trying to talk to them in the second category. They rejected truth knowingly, and they all, depending on the narration of who they were, it was included Abu Jahl and Umayyah, and these were enemies of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, the leaders of the Quraysh at that time. So they died on disbelief. They died on disbelief while knowing he was actually the Prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْكَفَرَةُ الْفَجَرَةُ, the disbelievers and the profligates. We've talked about the word profligate and the root word fajara. It's someone who breaks rules, and they don't just break rules because they're weak or whatnot. They don't think they actually have to follow them. They're kind of like above the rule. And a fajr is someone who may be like that with one or two rules, but fujjar is like the plural, or fajra is like the emphatic form. These, the people who this is the way they live, they actually don't care to follow. They think they're above the law at some level, and they don't care to follow them. And there's a description from Ibn Ajiba. It says that people who disbelieve tend to have this quality because they don't care about what the truth is. If they don't care about what the truth, then they don't really care about the rules. If you don't care about reality, life, death, God, the afterlife, who are you? Who are you supposed to be? Then, consideration for what's right and wrong, according to truth and according to God, there's not going to be that attention. It will be basically like, I will get away with whatever I can get away with in this life. And it's really interesting. There was a study that was done that asked, I think, an audience of people, and this is a little bit, disclaimer, this is a little bit sensitive as a topic. If anyone here doesn't want to hear the next few sentences, it is rated R. In one of my psychology classes, when I was in college, I remember being shocked by this, that in audience, there was a survey that was done with college students it was asked of them, if you could get away with rape and not be punished for it, right? The law would not hold you accountable. You would just completely get away with it. Would you do it? And 40% of the people who took the test said yes. So, that's someone who does not care about the reality of this is ethical, this is unethical. What they care about is, can I get away with it? Can I not get away with it? And so the profligate, again, is someone who doesn't care about what's right and wrong. And so they are people who break. They don't just break the rules, break the law. They end up breaking society in different ways as a result, and it tends to be a quality of oppressive people. So let me go back. The idea of being covered with dust indicates complete and utter humiliation, right? يومئذ عليها غبرة. غبرة is dust. That's the that's part of the punishment, is not just that where they will end up going, but they will be in a very humiliated state, and also that their faces will be overspread with darkness. And it said again, this is a reflection of the darkness that was in their hearts, that they had rejected the truth, and they did not care for it. The punishment, Imam al-Alusi, he mentions that the punishment for disbelief in God causes faces to be covered with dust, and the punishment for profligacy is it causes the faces to be overspread with darkness. And that's also something that is interesting, because the sins that that we do does have an effect on our spiritual hearts, and then it's not just something that stays there, it manifests on our faces, subhanAllah, in different ways. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us to be of those who purify our hearts, and may He purify our faces and make them radiant towards Him on the Day of Judgment. Now I want to look at some of the things that Ibn Ajiba says regarding these verses. He brings something interesting. He says that the first time that someone had to flee from their brother was when Habil, the prophet, had to flee from Qabil. Right, the son of Adam had to flee from his own brother, but this was because his brother was harmful to him. And the first time someone had to flee from their parents was when the prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam had to flee from his father. And the first time that people had to, I shouldn't say the first time, but an example of someone fleeing from their spouse is when the prophets Nuh and Lut both had to actually flee from their wives. And then fleeing from children, the prophet Nuh actually had to flee from his own son. And in this is also something that is important to reflect on, that sometimes there may be people, and they can even be family, they can be close friends, but they are pulling a person away from God, or they are pulling a person to do sins that they would not commit otherwise. They're pulling a person towards a bad direction. And depending on the circumstance, it's not necessarily that you always have to physically flee from them, but at least spiritually flee from them, meaning one, to limit, if especially if a person feels like they are, whenever they are around them, they're heavily influenced and they fall into things that they would not do on their own, then if there is a possibility to limit exposure to them, then that's what you do. You maintain an acquaintance, but you actually leave that the best friendship with people who are going to cause a person to go away from God. But if that person is there, and when you spend time with them, you actually influence them, and you are someone who pulls them towards God, then it's encouraged usually to actually stay in and have companionship with them, because you are pulling them towards the right way. It's not that they're influencing you, you are the influencer on them, and you are pulling them towards what's good. So that's one thing to reflect on, is people who I know in COVID-19 we're just at home in lockdown, but aside from that, outside of this particular circumstance, who are our close friends, are the people that have an influence on us, and how do they influence us? And sometimes people have rights over us because they're family, and how do you maintain the rights that people have over you? Because that's part of our iman as well, without then being harmed by overexposure. A person may have, for example, a family member who does nothing but backbite all day long. If they spend 5 minutes with them, they're just going to start backbiting. If they spend 10 minutes with them, they're going to start backbiting. If they call for just a check-in, it's going to be backbiting. So how do you limit exposure to someone who's, is doing that nonstop? And how do you navigate that relationship? How do you flee from someone who is inadvertently trying, pulling you away from the way of God? Doesn't mean, again, you sever ties, especially not family ties, but it means that we create boundaries for ourselves, healthy boundaries, and ones that make it so that when we are with people, the companionship that we share with them will be beneficial to them or beneficial to us, but regardless, it will be beneficial companionship and not harmful companionship. Ibn Ajiba also mentions that one of the reasons why the faces are so radiant and luminous on that day is because of the faith that people have. The light of faith that people have in their hearts actually pours out through their face. That the darkness is an indication of the distance that people had from God and from his remembrance and from caring about him. And he says, Nas'alullahu as-salama wal-afiyah. Essentially, may Allah grant us protection from ever being from the second category. There's a good question here. Even if we are influencers, can't we also be susceptible? How do we balance and protect ourselves from being influenced? I think that it depends specifically on the context. But one thing that comes to mind is that, and I found this in my own life, actually, subhanAllah, when I was in college and when I was in high school, is we had, alhamdulillah, we had our high school MSA, we had our college MSA, and all sorts of people were involved and would come from all different backgrounds to MSA in high school and college. There are people who would come to the MSA meeting with their girlfriends and boyfriends. They'd come to this was a place that they were coming and trying to be a part of the community, and it was welcoming to them still, subhanAllah. And so that's one thing, is that I noticed that when people of many different backgrounds and levels of knowledge and practice come together, when they come together for something beneficial, then everyone is busy doing that good thing, right? So if it's like Palestine Awareness Week or Islam Awareness Week or the Dawah table or whatever event is going on, it's social justice related, it's not social justice related, but it's good work, that actually creates an opportunity for really beautiful friendships to form, because it's actually filled with doing beneficial things together, right? Rolling up your sleeves together, putting up posters together. And then afterwards there's a break for lunch or whatever. And then afterwards there's time to pray and whatever. And so subhanAllah, the whole system makes it so that the engagement is not, harmful. And it doesn't mean that, especially within that space, it doesn't mean that there weren't some folks who would come and then leave and go and do something completely different. And that's not, like, let's say, MSA appropriate. But at least when in the space of being involved with MSA, or even the sister social activities or the brother social activities, it was, for the most part, a really healthy environment. And I think that that's one of the ways to really grow in a relationship with anyone, is to engage in something good or beneficial, something service related. If there's a gathering, a dinner party, friends, relatives, being the person who washes the dishes and picks up the cups and is just helpful towards people. They don't have to be the life of the party, laughing and joking. They can actually be the person who's helping to pass out the food, making sure everyone's fed. You take on a role that's of benefit in a gathering, and it ends up being, you end up benefiting still. And you also have some distance if there's something or talk or whatever that's going on that's you can't get away from fully. If you're busy with serving people, tea and coffee or whatever it is, it's a way to sort of sidestep that, and there's reward in serving people, and in that is also a level of distance from if there's something that's in that company that may be not beneficial. But I do think it depends on specific circumstances, because every situation is different. Now I want to go on to the ishara that Ibn Ajiba, I love this part of the tafsir, when Ibn Ajiba shares with us some of his reminders, and some of his metaphorical lessons. And he says, when the trumpet or the piercing cry comes, which is the divine call that enraptures the heart of the believer to come into the divine presence, then the hearts come rushing to Allah, and they flee from everyone but Him. And when you see someone who's gifted in this way, and he says either by an intermediary or without an intermediary. Some people have this calling directly in their hearts. Allah puts it in their heart and they're pulled. And others will have that because through an intermediary. And intermediaries, if like for example, the companions of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, their intermediary to that call to come and rush towards God was actually the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And for some people, that intermediary is going to be his inheritors, not him, right? But someone who's inherited from him, the true scholars, the true sheikhs, or the true spiritual guides that come into their life. And then through that intermediary, again, that piercing cry occurs and enraptures their heart. And so the person, whether through an intermediary or without, they flee creation. Relatives, friends, not in the sense of they're abandoning them, but the overall concern with caring about other people's business and all of that. And instead, they're seeking proximity to Allah, remembering Him, and they stay seeking, right, as a seeker and wayfaring until they reach their Lord. And they become firm in witnessing Him and experiencing the divine witnessing. And then after that, after they become firm in that, then they return to creation. But they are returning to creation, returning to their families and friends with their bodies. But their hearts have already departed from them. Their hearts are now with God. And it doesn't mean that they don't love their family. They love their family actually more. They love creation even more. But the way that they love them comes out of their love of God. The way that they witness them is through their witnessing of God. And there's a beautiful poem by Rab al-Adawiyya. And, please forgive the translation. Ibn Ajiba quotes it. He says, and he mentions the poem from her, and she said, I made you, talking to Allah, capital Y, I made you the one who talks to my heart, and I allowed my body to be with the one who wants to sit with me. So my body is there to sit with the one who sits with me. But the love of my heart in the heart is closer. Or like another translation is, but the soulmate of my heart in my heart is closer. Meaning that her, the other people will physically sit next to her, but who is with her in her heart is closer to her than those who are sitting there with her. Imam al-Qushayri, he also says something really beautiful. And I think this is something we can really reflect on, especially during such uncertain times. Things are changing. Is the mall open? Is it closed? Is the beach open? Is it closed? Is school going to be opening? Is it closed? Is my job going to call me back next week? Or is it, do I have to figure out something else? We are experiencing that level of, worldly uncertainty together. And when I read this, subhanAllah, I thought like, wow, what a statement that just like helps erase everything and all the outward uncertainties. Imam al-Qushayri, he says that istiqama, it's a word that usually means staying on the straight path. He says is to spiritually witness the time of Qiyamah, to spiritually recognize, right, the time of Yawm al-Qiyamah. And so the people who know God, the people who are close to God, they flee from material attachments and concerns, and they're ultimately concerned with their own standing with God. And so they are not busy with other than him. And they're not nosy about others, and they're not attached incorrectly to them. So in the world of cause and effect, right, we live currently in the world of cause and effect, the material world, and we can get lost in those details. But the one who spiritually witnesses the reality of the day of judgment, what's important on that day, right, then the only thing that matters to them, and they flee from everything else, is what will my standing with God be? And that's what I'm going to go after. That's what my focus is. Everything else is secondary. Everything else is unnecessary and not my focus. I'm going to focus on God. I'm going to focus on what's pleasing to him, how to draw myself closer to him, how I would love for, to be from the people whose faces are shining and bright and overjoyed. What can I do to be from those people? We have subhanAllah, we're still alive in this world. We have time to strive for that. And everything else really doesn't matter. If you imagine yourself right now standing in front of God on the day of judgment, like the majority of issues that are concerning people throughout the day really don't matter. And it's like what really mattered was how the person is with God and how the person is with creation as it relates to what is pleasing to God and what is not pleasing to God. Ibn Atta, he said that the radiance of faces is because these are people who are always looking towards their master, and they are laughing because of his pleasure with them, right? And obviously we cannot see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? We live in this world and we are created beings, but a face that is always, facing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or facing toward their master, meaning that they are someone who's turning in the direction that God is pleased with. They're not turning away from his direction. They're not so preoccupied with, being so busy that they don't remember him. No, their faces are turned towards him in this life. And so, and that's why their faces are so luminous. Imam al-Qushayri, he says that the darkened faces are because they didn't know Allah, and the knowledge of Allah brings light to one's face. And so they were far from him and veiled from him. Ibn Ajiba also, he ends with a beautiful prayer, and I want to mention that prayer because anytime he makes a prayer, I want all of us to say Ameen. We're reading his tafsir. He says, Allahumma asfir wujuhana bi nuri dhatik. Oh Allah, make our faces radiant by the light, by your light. Wa adhikna wa bashirna bayna awliyaik fi dunya wal akhirah. And make us laugh and be overjoyed, and counted with your intimate friends in this life and in the next. Innaka ala kulli shay'in qadir, and you are truly over all things capable. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam taslima. And the peace and blessings of Allah be upon our Master Muhammad and his family and his companions. So that is his prayer. We have a little bit of time for questions. My goal today was actually for us to finish before Maghrib, and alhamdulillah, I think this might be a first in our tafsir class that we've ever been able to finish at the time that I had hoped. So I'm excited about that. Before we close with the dua, if anyone has any questions or any thoughts, anything they wanted to share, they can do so now. As something to, as a point of practice for us for this week, is when we are bothered by something, when we are overwhelmed by something, this week I want us to remember the words of Imam al-Qushayri, which is to try to spiritually recognize in that moment the reality of the day of judgment. If you find yourself, oh my gosh, what's going on with, specifically with worldly concerns, material concerns, whatever it is, and it's taking up some capacity in your focus and your time, the practice for this week is for us again to try to remember to spiritually witness the reality of the day of judgment. A good way to try to remember that is actually when we stand in prayer, that when we stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for any of the 5 prayers or any of the nawafil, to imagine us ourselves actually standing before him on the day of judgment. Remembering the day of judgment is part of the prayer, right? It's part of even the recitation of what we say. But the spiritual witnessing of the reality of the day of judgment is something I think that it's almost an act of relief, right? One of the interpretations of why the faces are so light and overjoyed is because they are relieved from the attachments and the burdens of this world. They've been given the pass for the next life, right? And so they're relieved, like I don't have to think about dunya anymore. I don't have to think about what happened. And there's some relief in that. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us to actually have relief in remembering, that al-akhirah is real and he is real. And, may that realization, inshallah, guide us towards what's most pleasing to him. So just checking if there are any questions. I don't see any. Okay, so I'm going to ask, I know there are not questions, but I always like to ask, what's the weekly assignment for this week? I just said it. Just want to make sure everyone's paying attention. You can put it in the chat box or you can say it out loud.
Is it to make sure you think about the day of judgment if you're overly concerned about something in this world?
That's right. Barakallahu fiki. Thank you so much. Alhamdulillah. See, there's something called a fard kifaya. Fard kifaya is basically if one person fulfills the obligation, it saves everyone else from having to fulfill it. So like praying janazah on someone is fard kifaya. If some believers do it, then the whole ummah, for example, doesn't have to do it because some people fulfilled it. I'm not talking about fara'id here, but you're someone who alleviated everyone else having to answer because, alhamdulillah, you came forward and answered. And also, Janice, thank you so much to spiritually remember the day of judgment when we are feeling overwhelmed or anxious. So that is the assignment, inshallah. So you have alleviated it from your friends. And also Yusra mentioned this as well. Meditate on the day of judgment in our prayers. That's a good time to do it, to imagine that we're standing in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on that day. And inshallah, whatever is beneficial is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whatever I said that is wrong and mistaken is from myself and shaitan. Inshallah, we'll end with a dua. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Allahumma waffiqna lima tuhibbuhu wa tarda. Waj'alna min abidika as-su'ada. Ammitna ala kalimat al-huda. علمنا ما ينفعنا ووفقنا للعمل بما علمتنا به واجعل ما نحن فيه خالصا مخلصا لوجهك الكريم آمين يا رب العالمين اللهم اجعل تجمعنا هذا تجمعا مرحوما وتفرقنا بعده تفرقا معصوما لا شقيا منا ولا محروما وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, peace and blessings be upon our Master Muhammad, his noble family, companions, and followers until the end of time. O God, give us success to attain what you love and are pleased with. Make us among your felicitous servants. Allow us to die on the statement of guidance. Teach us what will benefit us and give us success to act upon what you taught us. Make that in which we are engaged pure and devoted to your noble face. Ameen, O Lord of the worlds. O God, make this gathering of ours a gathering enveloped in mercy, and our parting thereafter a parting of our sins purged and forgiven, not one of us wretched or deprived. And peace and blessings be upon our Master Muhammad and upon his noble family, followers, and companions. Ameen. Thank you all for joining. And also thank you, Saad, on YouTube for giving the same answer. Alhamdulillah, I'm so glad people are paying attention. Barakallahu fikum. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us.